On the evening of November 12, 2023, at precisely 7:15 p.m., a cold wind swept through the dense woods surrounding the isolated farmhouse in upstate New York. The old house, built in the early 1900s, stood silently against the backdrop of a darkening sky, its weathered exterior bearing witness to decades of harsh winters and fleeting summers. Inside, 17-year-old Emily Carter sat alone in the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. Her parents, Robert and Susan Carter, had died just a week earlier in what was initially deemed a tragic car accident. The loss had left her with no choice but to move in with her estranged stepbrother Jason, who was 10 years older and whom she barely knew. Jason had arrived earlier that day, driving up from New York City, where he worked as a freelance photographer. He had been distant, his few words laced with a quiet tension that Emily couldn't quite place. As the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just the grief. Something about Jason's demeanor unnerved her. He had always been an enigma, a shadowy figure in her life who appeared briefly at family gatherings only to disappear just as quickly. At 8 p.m., Jason retreated to his room upstairs, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She remembered the last time she had seen him, nearly 5 years ago at a Thanksgiving dinner. He had been withdrawn then too, but now there was a coldness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Emily's mind wandered back to the accident that had taken her parents' lives. It had happened at 2:45 a.m. on November 5th, a collision with a tree on a deserted road just outside of town. The police had ruled it an accident. Robert had been driving and the roads were slick with rain, but something about it didn't add up. Emily had spent the days after the funeral going through her parents' belongings, looking for anything that might help her understand the life they had led outside the small, quiet home. In the attic, she found a box of old photographs and letters, some addressed to Jason from years ago. One letter, dated September 9th, 2018, caught her eye. It was from her father, expressing regret for something that had happened long ago, something he had kept from her. The letter ended abruptly, as if Robert had stopped writing in the middle of a thought. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the date, just a week before Jason had left town for good. By 9:30 p.m., the house was eerily silent. Emily decided to confront Jason the next morning. She needed answers, and she felt that whatever secrets were buried in her family's past, Jason held the key. As she turned out the lights and headed to bed, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. In the darkness, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was just beginning. The morning of November 13th, 2023, dawned with a heavy mist clinging to the trees surrounding the farmhouse. At 7 a.m., Emily awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The remnants of her uneasy sleep lingered as she got up, the cold floorboards creaking under her feet. Downstairs, she found Jason already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. His eyes were fixed on something outside the window, his face a blank mask that gave nothing away. The tension from the previous night lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. As she made herself a cup of tea, Emily noticed how meticulously Jason had arranged his belongings in the kitchen. His suitcase, placed neatly in the corner, was still packed, an odd detail she couldn't ignore. It was as if he didn't plan on staying long. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought him back to this remote house, after so many years of avoiding it. By 8:30 a.m., they were both seated at the table, the silence between them broken only by the occasional sound of Jason flipping through an old newspaper he had found on the counter. The mundane act felt out of place, almost forced, as if he was trying too hard to appear relaxed. Emily's gaze fell on the clock on the wall, the ticking sound louder than usual, marking each passing second with an unbearable weight. As the morning progressed, Emily found herself watching Jason closely, observing the way he moved through the house with a certain familiarity that suggested he had spent much more time there than she had ever realized. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on certain spots, like the old family portrait hanging in the hallway, or the worn armchair by the fireplace, where their father had spent countless evenings. These small details, seemingly insignificant, began to pile up in Emily's mind, forming a picture she couldn't yet understand. At 10 a.m., Jason suggested they take a walk around the property. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the mist still hung in the air like a veil, muting the colors of the autumn leaves. As they walked in silence, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions: grief, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was as if the landscape itself held the secrets of their family, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. They reached the edge of the woods around 10:45 a.m., where an old swing set stood, half buried in the overgrown grass. Emily remembered playing there as a child, before the family dynamics had shifted, before Jason had pulled away from them all. The sight of it brought back a rush of memories, some sweet, others tinged with the bitterness of loss. Jason seemed lost in thought as he stared at the swing, his face unreadable. Over the next few days, a fragile bond began to form between them, built on shared grief and unspoken understanding. At 3 p.m. on November 14th, Emily found herself in the attic again, sorting through the same box of old photographs she had discovered earlier. Jason joined her, his presence a quiet comfort she hadn't expected. Together, they sifted through the remnants of their parents' lives, piecing together fragments of a past that seemed both familiar and foreign. Emily noticed how Jason's demeanor softened as they worked side by side. He pointed out pictures she had never seen before, snapshots of their father as a young man, their mother smiling brightly at some long-forgotten picnic. It was in these moments that Emily saw glimpses of the brother she had known before the distance grew between them. But even as they shared these memories, the sense of unease never fully left her. By the evening of November 15th, 2023, Emily had started to feel a strange pull towards Jason, a confusing mix of familial love and something more dangerous. It was as if the boundaries between them were beginning to blur, and she couldn't tell if it was the isolation of the house, the weight of their shared grief, or something else entirely. That night, around 11 p.m., she found herself standing outside Jason's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hesitated, the memory of the letter she had found still fresh in her mind. The words from their father had hinted at a secret that Jason had kept hidden for years, a secret that had the power to change everything. Emily felt the pull of curiosity mixed with fear. She stepped back, returning to her room, but the questions gnawed at her. The days continued to pass, each one pulling them closer together, yet driving Emily deeper into her doubts. By November 18th, 2023, Emily knew she could no longer ignore the growing tension between them. The fragile bond they had formed now felt like a thread stretched too tight, ready to snap. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a maze of shadows and unanswered questions, and Emily was no longer sure where Jason fit into it, or if she could trust him at all. As the clock struck midnight on November 19th, 2023, Emily lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered throughout the house, waiting for her to put them together. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, the last thought that crossed her mind was the certainty that the truth would soon come to light, whether she was ready for it or not. On the morning of November 20th, 2023, at 6:45 a.m., Emily woke to the sound of rain pounding against the windows. The storm had rolled in overnight, drenching the woods surrounding the farmhouse in a relentless downpour. The air inside felt heavy, as though the storm had seeped into the very walls of the old house. Emily's unease from the previous night had only deepened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. By 7:30 a.m., Emily found herself drawn back to the attic. The boxes of old photographs and letters had become a sort of obsession, a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. The memory of the letter she had found days earlier haunted her, the unfinished words from her father gnawing at her thoughts. As she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as though it held its breath, anticipating what she might find. The attic was dimly lit, the single bulb casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Emily went straight to the box where she had found the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she sifted through its contents. At 8:10 a.m., She uncovered an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. The initials R.C. were embossed on the front, Robert Carter, her father. She opened the journal carefully, the pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were dated, spanning from 2016 to 2018, a period of time when Jason had been most distant from the family. The first entry she read, dated June 14, 2016, was a detailed account of a strained relationship with Jason. Her father wrote about arguments and misunderstandings that had driven a wedge between them. But it wasn't just the usual family disagreements. There were references to money, a business deal gone wrong, and a growing distrust. The tension that Emily had always sensed between her father and Jason now seemed to have deeper, more troubling roots. At 9:25 a.m., Emily stumbled upon an entry from December 3, 2017, that made her blood run cold. Her father had written about receiving threatening letters, anonymous notes that warned him to stay silent about a past mistake. The language was vague, but the fear in her father's words was palpable. He mentioned that Jason had found one of the notes and insisted it was nothing to worry about. But Robert had felt differently. The entry ended with a haunting line, "Secrets have a way of coming back to haunt us." Emily's hands shook as she turned to the final entry, dated September 5, 2018, just days before Jason had abruptly left town. This entry was shorter, but the urgency in her father's writing was undeniable. He expressed regret over a decision he had made years ago, one that involved Jason directly. There was mention of a payment, hush money, as her father called it, to keep someone quiet. The entry ended with a chilling confession, "I fear what Jason might do if the truth ever comes out." By 10:45 a.m., Emily had read the entire journal, each entry adding another layer to the dark web of secrets that seemed to entangle her family. She felt a growing sense of dread as she realized that her father's death might not have been an accident after all. The journal hinted at something much more sinister, a past that both Robert and Jason had been desperate to keep hidden. Emily knew she needed to confront Jason, but the fear of what she might uncover kept her rooted in place. At 11:30 a.m., she forced herself to leave the attic, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. She went downstairs to find Jason, determined to get answers. She found him in the living room, staring into the cold, empty fireplace, as if lost in thought. Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of the confrontation about to unfold. She had spent the past few days trying to understand Jason, trying to bridge the gap between them, but now she realized that there was a darkness in him that she hadn't been willing to see. As the clock struck 12 p.m., Emily finally approached Jason, her heart pounding in her chest. She held out the journal, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition or guilt. Jason's expression remained unreadable as he took the journal from her, flipping through the pages slowly. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive. Emily could feel the tension rising, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. At 12:15 p.m., Jason closed the journal and set it down on the table. He looked at Emily, his gaze unreadable, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Whatever fragile bond they had built was now shattered by the weight of the secrets that had come to light. Emily knew that the time for truth had come, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for what that truth might reveal. As the afternoon wore on, the storm outside grew more intense, the wind howling through the trees like a warning. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The secrets she had uncovered were only the beginning. The real danger lay in what was still hidden, and in the man who stood before her, holding the key to it all. The next step was clear. Emily needed to know exactly what Jason had done and why their father had feared him so deeply. But as the clock ticked closer to 1 p.m., she realized that uncovering the truth might cost her more than she was willing to pay. The storm wasn't just outside, it was inside the house, and it was about to break. At 1:15 in the afternoon on November 20th, 2023, the storm outside had intensified, lashing the farmhouse with sheets of rain and howling winds. Inside, the tension between Emily and Jason had reached a boiling point. After their silent confrontation over the journal, the air between them was thick with unspoken questions and simmering fear. Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from Jason as he paced the length of the living room, his movements tense and deliberate like a predator preparing to strike. As the minutes ticked by, Emily felt the walls of the old house closing in around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows seemed amplified, feeding the growing sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that had been set in motion long before she arrived. At 1:45 in the afternoon, Emily retreated to her room, desperate for a moment to collect her thoughts. She sat on the edge of her bed, the rain pounding against the window like a drumbeat, relentless and unyielding. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past week over and over. The car accident that had claimed her parents' lives, the journal entries that hinted at a dark secret, and now Jason's eerie calm in the face of it all. Every detail seemed to fit together, forming a picture that Emily was too afraid to fully acknowledge. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 2:05 in the afternoon. The realization that she was alone in the house with Jason, with no one else for miles around, sent a shiver down her spine. The storm had knocked out the power earlier in the day, leaving the house in a gloomy half-light that only added to her anxiety. The thought of leaving crossed her mind, but she knew the roads would be impassable in the storm, trapping her in the house with the one person she couldn't trust. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Emily heard a noise from downstairs, a loud thud, followed by the sound of footsteps. Her heart leaped into her throat as she stood, every instinct telling her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She moved to the door and cracked it open just enough to peer down the hallway. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. She held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. When the footsteps stopped outside her door, Emily froze. She could feel Jason's presence on the other side, the air thick with the weight of his unspoken intentions. The door creaked as it slowly began to open, and Emily's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated, moving back down the hallway. The door remained slightly ajar, leaving Emily in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve on edge. She knew she couldn't keep running from the truth, that she needed to confront Jason before whatever he was planning could come to fruition. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Emily made her way downstairs, her footsteps careful and deliberate. The living room was empty, the only sound the steady drip of water from a leak in the roof. The journal still lay on the coffee table, its pages now scattered as if in a hurry. Emily's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Jason, but he was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive silence of the house pressed in on her, suffocating in its intensity. As she turned towards the kitchen, something caught her eye, a dark stain on the floor near the fireplace, almost imperceptible in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The secrets she had uncovered were only the beginning. The real horror was just beginning to reveal itself. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Emily steeled herself, knowing that the final confrontation with Jason was inevitable. Whatever he was hiding, whatever he had done, she was about to find out. The storm outside raged on, but the true storm was inside the house, brewing just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. By 3:15 in the afternoon on November 20th, 2023, the storm had reached its peak, the wind shrieking through the trees and battering the farmhouse with relentless fury. Inside, Emily stood frozen near the fireplace, her eyes locked on the dark stain that now seemed to spread before her like a creeping shadow. The oppressive silence of the house was suddenly shattered by a loud crash from the basement, sending a jolt of fear through her. Her heart raced as she realized that Jason was down there, hidden in the depths of the old house, where secrets and darkness had always lingered. The basement door, slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, beckoned her forward with a silent, ominous invitation. Emily knew that whatever had been set in motion all those years ago was about to reach its violent conclusion. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Emily descended the narrow stairs into the basement, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of earth and mildew. The dim light from a single bare bulb flickered overhead, casting twisted shadows on the concrete walls. As she reached the bottom, she spotted Jason near an old workbench, his back turned to her. His movements were frantic, as if he were trying to cover something up. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. There, on the floor beside Jason, was a small, shallow grave, hastily dug into the dirt floor of the basement. Panic surged through her as she realized that this was no ordinary grave. It was the final resting place for the truth that Jason had tried so desperately to bury. And now, it was about to be uncovered. At 3:25 in the afternoon, Jason turned to face her, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and desperation. The darkness she had sensed in him was fully exposed now, raw and terrifying. Emily's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the journal, the letters, and the stain upstairs. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Jason had been involved in their parents' deaths, and this basement held the evidence he had tried to erase. Emily's pulse quickened as Jason took a step toward her, his expression shifting from fear to something far more dangerous. She knew she was trapped, with nowhere to run and no one to help her. The storm outside raged on, but the real danger was in the man standing before her, ready to do whatever it took to keep his secrets hidden. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the tension between them snapped like a taut wire. Jason lunged, and Emily reacted on instinct, grabbing a heavy metal tool from the workbench. The struggle was brief, violent, and in the end, it was Emily who emerged victorious, standing over Jason's motionless body as the storm continued to rage outside. As she stood there, breathless and trembling, Emily knew that this was only the beginning. The truth was out, but the consequences had yet to unfold. The storm had broken, but the aftermath would be far more devastating. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on November 20th, 2023, the storm outside began to ease, the violent winds giving way to a cold, steady rain. Inside the farmhouse, Emily stood in the dimly lit basement, her breath still ragged from the struggle. Jason lay lifeless on the dirt floor, the final damning evidence of his crimes now laid bare beside him. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder fading into the distance. Emily's mind raced, the reality of what had just happened sinking in like a weight pressing down on her chest. The secrets she had uncovered, the truth about her parents' deaths, and Jason's desperate attempts to hide it all, it had culminated in this brutal, tragic moment. She knew she had no choice but to call the authorities, to bring everything into the harsh light of day. At 4:15 in the afternoon, she climbed the stairs, leaving the basement and its horrors behind. As she reached the living room, Emily felt the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The storm had passed, but the scars it left would remain. The truth was out, and now Emily would have to face the consequences, no matter how devastating they might be.